Thank you very much, Speaker, and good morning. This bill requires persons who operate supportive living accommodations in specified circumstances to hold a license issued by the minister. It provides a framework to be supplemented by regulations governing applications for and issuance of licenses, the obligations of persons who operate a supportive living accommodation under the authority of a license, inspections and complaints. And I'd like to start today's speaker with a story from Karen Barry. In October of 2017, her father was discharged from a lengthy stay at Grand River Hospital. He was unable to return to his apartment and unable to live independently without assistance. Ineligible at that time for long-term care, he was placed in an unregulated group home in St. Thomas. The home assured Karen that he would be provided with support, trained staff, 3 meals plus refreshments, and a snack daily. It sounded suitable for him until he could secure a room in long-term care. What resulted was months of concern for his well-being, safety, and security. Almost every cent of his pension was handed over to a for-profit supportive living organization. The home was owned by Vishal Shittal. At the time, he was operating under an alias of Charlie Duke. In this home, there were bed bugs, garbage piled up for weeks, and shortages of hot water. The basement beneath him was used for food storage, but infested with rodents. Frequently, there would be shortages of food, and the list goes on. In the words of Karen, quote, "He lived in fear and neglect, and he paid a significant amount each month to do so." What was supposed to be a supportive living accommodation for him ended up being a nightmare I can't forget. I don't think he can either. Speaker, just this month, I brought the story of Gerald and his wife Lucy to this House. They are currently living in a supportive living accommodation, also owned by Mr. Shittal. Gerald and his wife have major health issues, including dementia, and are pensioners on a fixed income. Gerald's sister, Loretta, sent me a desperate email along with pictures of unlivable conditions. Loretta said there have been bed bugs for at least a year, and the food that is served to residents is rotten. When Loretta raised the issue with management, the owners said this was the last time their management team would be dealing with the issues. If they had additional concerns, feel free to move out. Many people who have complex needs but don't qualify for or can't get into long-term care end up in these supportive living homes. Supportive living accommodations provide low-rent accommodation to vulnerable tenants who are considered high need. Many of them are seniors. These shared rental accommodations traditionally include any combination of room and board, or room and board with additional levels of support, which are paid for. In many cases, SLAs serve as an effective response to affordable housing shortages across the province, while catering to high-need adults who may not necessarily qualify for long-term care. Many people end up there simply because they fall through the cracks. However, the lack of regulation and oversight of these services for our most vulnerable citizens have in some cases resulted in physical harm and, tragically, even death. David McPherson lived in a supportive living home in the City of London called People to People. Like the home Karen spoke about, it appeared to be a group home with additional supports. Many of the adults and seniors who lived there suffered from severe mental issues and physical disabilities. Despite this, Keith Charles, the operator of the home, was racking up infractions from the local fire department. The home was filled with people, broken smoke detectors, emergency lights, clogged hallways, and propped open fire doors. On November 3rd, 2014, the same day that local fire officials were meeting to put in a call into Ontario Fire Marshal to close the property because of increasing numbers of complaints, the home was set ablaze. As a result, 72-year-old David McPherson tragically died. David's death was completely unavoidable and preventable. Because these homes are privately run and operated, owners are accountable to no one and are free to operate the business however they please. Falling into a regulatory gray zone, their tenants are at an enormous risk. Speaker, over the past year, we've seen numerous supports of supportive living homes in my riding in Niagara being fined for non-compliance for fire-related charges. On November 2019, Beatrice Manor in Welland was fined $35,000 for non-compliance with the fire code. Chief Brian Kennedy said they have 5 years to make the required changes, but they chose not to do so. It's the largest fine he's ever seen. Some municipalities have started to regulate these homes. Following the death of David McPherson, the City of London put bylaws in place. However, municipalities are asking for provincial regulation of these homes. This bill provides a framework for operators and sets minimum standards that must be met so that vulnerable tenants no longer suffer from a broken system. The bill defines what a home is, requires home operators to be licensed, similar to retirement homes, and would set a framework for inspection and complaint protocols. Failure to have a license is punishable for a fine up to $1,000 per day. This is not the first time this legislation has been presented to this legislature. In 2017, my predecessor, MPP Cindy Forster, brought a bill forward after hearing complaints about supportive living homes from support workers, tenants, and families in the region. MPP Forster worked with Welland City Councillor Bonnie Folkens and many other municipal officials to address this dire situation. 44 municipalities have come forward with their concerns and their support. In January of this year, Port Colborne reaffirmed their support of the bill, passing a motion stating, and I quote, "There is a need for regulating private supportive living accommodations to protect individuals requiring special care." Beyond municipalities, numerous stakeholder organizations have joined the call for provincial regulation of supportive living homes. Sean Billis, the CEO of Pastone Mental Health in Niagara, stated, "Our vulnerable people are entitled to supportive living accommodations that will provide a reasonably healthy lifestyle that includes a place to live, quality food, and proper care." The International Association of Firefighters, Local 485, and the Welland Professional Firefighters endorsed the bill. In a letter to my office, Mike Biggins, president of the Welland Firefighters Association, IAFF, Local 481, stated, "Our members frequently attend some of these residences and are often appalled at the living conditions. The issues that some assisted living residences may not need the definition of a care occupancy as defined in the Ontario Fire Code, thus precluding those buildings from complying with provisions that are more stringent. If the assisted living residence is not regulated as a long-term care home or retirement home and does not meet certain care occupancy definitions, there is no oversight on how these homes are kept or operated. Many residents who live in assisted living residences have cognitive disabilities and are incapable of living independently. Unfortunately, some assisted living residence owners-operators intentionally operate these residences in a manner that allows the homes to remain unregulated, likely done to avoid expenditures relating to maintenance. The Welland Firefighters Association completely endorses this private member's bill. If there are those who are opposed to this bill, we encourage them to visit an unregulated assisted living home in their community. Following this visit, we are confident they will change their position on this matter. Speaker, with the COVID-19 pandemic, there is a renewed importance to regulate these homes. Congregate living settings have been some of the hardest hit during outbreaks. Many vulnerable adults who are under the care of these private operators don't have the capacity to advocate for themselves and are living in horrific conditions, receiving substandard care. Reporting by Nora Loretto found that 82% of deaths of COVID-19 in Canada are linked to residential care facilities of various kinds. The difficulty with supportive living homes is that despite caring for the same clientele you would find in a group home or a long-term care facility, they have no obligation to report outbreaks. They also have no method for complaints, inspections, or regulation. We've heard reports of 30 residents or more sharing one bathroom in these facilities. It's estimated that Niagara has 19 supportive living homes, Niagara alone. The fear here is that there will be an outbreak, there will be few options for containment and no ability for the public to know of an outbreak. It's been very difficult, Speaker, for my staff and myself to monitor these homes during the outbreak, which underscores the need for a complaint protocol We don't know what's been happening. It was horrific prior to the pandemic, and God only knows what's been happening in these homes since COVID-19 began. So now is the perfect time to address this gap in policy and join other jurisdictions like Alberta in regulating these homes. The last time this bill was voted on, it received all party support. In fact, the now Associate Minister of Energy and the current Solicitor General spoke in support of this bill. Today, we have the opportunity to fix a long-standing policy gap and join together to protect the most vulnerable in our communities. I hope this House will join me in this effort and pass Bill 164, bring it to committee, and bring it into law. Thank you very much.
Further debate? The member for Whitby.
Thank you, Speaker. I'm pleased to participate in the second reading debate of Protecting Vulnerable Persons in Support of Living Accommodation Act. Certainly everyone in this legislature, Speaker, wants to ensure that people have safe homes that they're living in. And if the person who owns the property is saying that they're providing them with services and support, that it can actually be enforced, Speaker. I know from my 13 years of municipal experience that while there are licensed rooming houses and group homes which are properly regulated, there are also landlords who quite carelessly fill up their properties, whether it's with students or vulnerable people, simply to collect the rent. Whether they claim that they're offering some additional services or not, we know that these facilities are often now well maintained, that the living conditions in them are not very good, they're overcrowded, and that they are, in fact, often quite unsafe from the perspective of fire safety and security. This bill would ensure, Speaker, that there would be oversight, province-wide potentially, to ensure that these people are protected as they should be in their homes. It's not about taking away the ability from anybody, Speaker, to set up this kind of housing. It's simply to ensure that the conditions within it would be regulated, that there would be an enforcement mechanism. I know that our government is committed to ending homelessness and have made a number of investments towards good quality supportive housing, investments that would fund supportive housing units, that would in some cases take away from the need for vulnerable people to turn to these off-market housing situations. This bill, Speaker, requires these homes to be licensed and creates a framework for inspection and complaint protocols to protect some of the most vulnerable citizens. I certainly know from my experience both within the constituency office and again at the municipal level that when a strategy is brought into place to help people who are homeless and find a home with supports, it has an immediate impact. Because it's not just good enough to say, here's a room or an apartment, Speaker, and leave them to their own devices if these people are people who need supports. These programs are incredibly successful and incredibly helpful programs, and in many cases, particularly at the municipal level, truly help them to turn their lives around. And I believe that that's what we all aspire to here in this Legislative Assembly. Speaker, this piece of legislation could also assist to ensure that these people are not being taken advantage of. And that's certainly a goal we can all support as well. I'm also happy to see in this bill, Speaker, that it's not meant to recreate licensing regimes which are already in place. And I think that's an important distinction going forward. Those types of homes that are already covered by other licensing regimes, municipal licensing, wouldn't be subject to a secondary regime, and I know the MPP from the Niagara Centre who's bringing forward this bill in his own municipal experience understands that, and I know that's why it's reflected as it is. Speaker, I do think that when this bill does make it to committee, there certainly are questions that need to be answered about what conditions the minister might impose on a license and what the enforcement provisions would be. We just need to get more clarity of that. We need to get feedback from a cross-section of stakeholders going forward. And I think that our experience has been within that particular setting, it serves to strengthen the legislation as it goes forward. And I offer that particular opinion also from my municipal experience as well, where broad consultation has taken place over the years on this particular subject. Speaker, we also have to be mindful that we should be encouraging our municipalities to actually allow for licensing and zoning of more facilities and homes like these. And that's going to take some discussion with the Association of Municipalities of Ontario at one level, particularly their policy group. But I think also with individual municipalities that comprise upper tier government, I think it'd be helpful also to engage with them, because not all of them are going to be able to participate in the standing committee forum. So as much as we can engage with those particular organizations now, I think it'll serve us well as we move forward with this particular proposed legislation. And I think also it's going to avoid creating barriers to creating this type of housing in various communities, because, you know, it's not, communities all have different pressure points across the province of Ontario. And I know those who have served in municipal government appreciate that distinction. With that, Speaker, I'd just like to conclude and say that the proposed legislation from the member from Niagara Centre is a good initiative. It's a good initiative, but we do need more broader consultation on it in some of the sectors that I've discussed. At the end of the day, and I said this earlier, and I believe this, we all aspire to protect the vulnerable in our society. So I thank the member for the bill. I look forward to engaging in the committee setting. Thank you.
Further debate? The member for London Fanshawe.
Thank you, Speaker. And it truly is an honour to rise on behalf of constituents of London Fanshawe to speak to Bill 164, because I'd like to tell a story of what happened in London that the member from Niagara Centre highlighted. So there was a complex, it's an apartment building at Oxford Street in London, Ontario, and it housed vulnerable people, people who had mental health issues and people who had addictions. And I would say the majority of them, if not all of them, were on ODSP or some form of OW. And housing is very difficult at the best of times to find, but when you combine health issues of addictions and mental health, it's even more difficult. And so a gentleman named complex. And secondly, people were hoping that it would get fixed, these problems would be fixed so that these vulnerable people, they had nowhere to go if they were to shut this building down. But the conclusion of the story is what happened is there was a fire in the apartment building. And David McPherson, who's 72 years old, died in that fire. Now the coroner didn't investigate a coroner's inquest. They didn't feel it was necessary. But I really think that in other cities like Hamilton, they took an initiative to actually regulate assisted living around some bylaws. London tried to do that as well, not as strong, I think, as that could be. And this is why this bill is very important, because it allows the province to do that work so that everything is the same. You go into one city, across Ontario to another, and the assisted living homes are all being treated the same and run the same, and the rules are the same. And I think that's something we need to understand is when it's affecting all of Ontario, we need to have a consistent legislation to protect the most vulnerable so that they're not taken advantage of, right? And, you know, some of these people who run these assisted livings, they may have their heart in the right place, but we also need to have the guidelines to protect the vulnerable citizens, because things can go wrong very quickly without anyone actually intending that to happen. I also just want to end by saying there's another complex in my riding on Hamilton Road. Again, they offer room and board. There's people who are on ODSP and OW. And I was visited by a person who lives there, and ODSP doesn't give the same housing allowance for someone if they live in a room and board situation. So she gets less housing benefit, accommodations, because she gets room and board. Where somebody else living individually, they receive more for that piece. So I think that needs to be corrected as well, wherever you're living. The ODSP and OW benefits do not help people living in poverty survive and have safe housing and have good food. So I'm going to end on that and encourage the government to support this bill and, like our member said, get it through the process and get it back here so we can vote on this bill. Thank you, Speaker.
Further debate? The member for Kitchener-Conestoga.
Thank you very much. And this is the first time I've actually risen on a Monday to debate private members' business, and just wanted to take a moment to recognize all the work our government House Leader has done to prioritize private members' business and make it possible to debate more bills and motions every week like this bill that we have before us today from the member from Niagara Centre. So, as I said, it is a pleasure to speak to the Protecting Vulnerable Persons and Supportive Accommodations Act. This is an important bill, and I want to thank the member for his work on it. As we have all heard, this bill would provide, would require operators of supportive living accommodations that provide the activities of daily living to hold a license issued by the Ministry of Children, Community and Social Services. Like long-term care homes, hospitals and retirement homes, group homes provide essential care to the province's most vulnerable. But unlike the facilities I mentioned before, not all residential living accommodations have a regulated license. Speaker, our Minister of Children, Community and Social Services is committed to improving the availability and quality of services in the developmental sector. Since taking on that role, he has been in constant communication with adults with developmental disabilities, their families, and our service providers about what we can do to improve the current services. And I know a key focus on his ministry's work on behalf of those with developmental disabilities is protecting, growing, and improving the current supply of residential residence services. I've met with constituents who have told me about their family's journey finding supportive living for their loved one, Madam Speaker. It's still a little early in the day for me, apparently. It is certainly a challenge, especially as parents who have been the primary caregiver for their child grow older and can't give them that same level of care anymore. I've also had a chance to connect with some of my local service providers, like Elmira District Community Living. I've chatted with Executive Director Greg Bichard a few times and toured their facility last year. Their homes support residents with intellectual disabilities in the townships of Woolwich, Wellesley, and Mapleton. I've also connected with Sunbeam Community and Developmental Services in Kitchener. Sunbeam has provided supports and services to children, youth, and adults with developmental services in the Waterloo region since 1956, Madam Speaker. They currently offer a range of residential programs, including 17 group homes and 2 overnight respite sites. And I had the pleasure of joining the Minister on his visit to Sunbeam Centre in early September on International Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorder Awareness Day. During his visit, the Minister made a great announcement of $3 million to increase resources, tools and strategies to support children with FASD. We also had a chance to meet with some of the board members and senior staff at Sunbeam, including those who work in the residential programs. The team there does great work caring for vulnerable people in our community, Madam Speaker. But I know not all group homes out there provide the same high level of care that Sunbeam and Elmira District Community Living do. And it's hard to believe, but there are some people out there taking advantage of families trying to find care and support for their loved ones, which is why I will be supporting this bill, because it is important to catch the bad actors and make sure Ontario's most vulnerable are taken care of. But I also hope we can find a way to get those with ill intentions out of our system without overburdening those doing the good work in our communities. There needs to be a balance so that those who provide a high standard of care can continue to do so and expand their capacity instead of having to shift focus of their staff to filling out paperwork and complying with duplicative regulations, Madam Speaker. Because I know in my community, capacity is a challenge, and it would be a shame to see service providers have to put additional money into administrative work rather than supporting frontline services. So thank you once again to the member from Niagara Centre for bringing this important bill forward. Protecting our most vulnerable, including those with developmental disabilities, is this minister's top priority, and I hope he will work with the minister and his team to find a way to achieve that balance. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Further debate? The member for Nickel Belt.
Thank you, Speaker, and I'm so pleased to support the bill brought forward by my colleague from Niagara Centre. And I want to also thank the previous MPP for this area, Cindy Foster, for making the House aware of what was going on. I hope that the second trial is a charm and it actually brings us result. Protecting vulnerable people and supportive living accommodation, those are really often known as rooming houses. They fill a critical need in communities all over the province, including my community and all over the north. But supporting living accommodation poorly regulated with no minimum standard has resulted in often suffering and deplorable condition and sometimes even death, like the member shared with us. It is time to fix that and to make sure that supporting living accommodation are a safe option for people who need to live independently. Before being an MPP, I was the Executive Director of the Community Health Centre in Sudbury, and we ran the Corner Clinic. The Corner Clinic was a way for people who experience homelessness to have access to care. And the first thing we would do is to try to house them. You cannot be healthy if you don't have a place to call your home. Most of the people suffered from severe mental illness, other health issue, physical disability, often dealt with addiction, and they become very hard to house. Those rooming houses were a place where we can get them back to health, and some of them do a very good job of this, but some of them are just taking advantage of vulnerable people who don't have a voice and take advantage of them in every possible ways possible. You can let your imagination go down a really dirty hole and it's still not deep enough for what we have seen into some of those living accommodation. All of this could change. We have the power right here in this House to change this by passing the bill from the member from Niagara Centre and putting things as simple as regulation, having minimum standard, having to report. Right now, most of the time, those people are thrown out of business through the fire department, because when all of the social agency, when all of the health agency, when everybody else, we know that what's going on in this rooming house is not okay, there is absolutely nothing we can do. So we phone the fire department, they will go in and do an inspection and find a way to shut them down through violation of the fire code. Really, Speaker, this is what we've come to in order to protect our most vulnerable. The government has a role to play. This is why we are in government, to make sure that we protect the most vulnerable in our community. And for this area, there is nothing. It is high time that we pass this bill from Niagara Centre to thank the good operator and to make sure the other ones are out of business. Thank you, Speaker.
Further debate? Further debate? The member for St. Catharines.
Thank you, Speaker, and good morning. And it's always an honour to be able to rise here in the House on behalf of the residents of St. Catharines. And I'd like to congratulate my colleague from Niagara Centre for bringing this motion forward. There's rarely a week that goes by that when a constituent doesn't stop me and talk to me about a problem they are experiencing within a nursing home in St. Catharines. Every so often, I have to pause the conversation to issue a point of clarification. Long-term care is used interchangeably with retirement homes or a hospice, or in some of the more shocking examples are from the deplorable conditions from some of the supported living accommodations. That is why I'm happy my colleague from Niagara Centre is bringing the legislation forward with Motion 164, Protecting Vulnerable Persons. This legislation is shining a light on a housing issue during a time when we know all too well the risk of leaving vulnerable people in deplorable conditions. You see, sometimes people can get caught up in this congregated care language. We know in this chamber that when referring to nursing homes, we are referring to homes regulated by a particular set of rules, a particular piece of legislation, actually, with a particular standard of minimum of care. Except my constituents don't care about the difference or the language or the legislation. What they want is what we all want, a minimal standard for the living conditions for older adults and vulnerable people to ensure they are kept safe and with dignity, Speaker. No one wants to see suffering, deplorable conditions, and even death due to a person's housing or care situation. You know what, Speaker? It's time to fix that. The solution to dignity of all vulnerable people is to take the lesson of the pandemic and apply it. Private companies administering care to under-regulated or loosely regulated markets with little oversight is problematic. It doesn't work. It is why I support the member from Niagara, Protecting Vulnerable Persons, that sets a minimum set of standards for supportive living accommodations. Speaker, I'm going to end with this note. The lesson of COVID-19 have shone a light on the travesties in long-term care. Understaffing, homes with bed bugs, and no cooling spaces during the heat wave of plus 40, to name just a few. So, if we still have problems with nursing homes that are being given the most attention right now, what does that mean for the other parts of the housing sector? Think about that. Like supportive living accommodations that are being given the least amount of attention. Politics aside, this is not about private versus public, or ideology, or even money. This is about doing the humane thing, common sense, things to protect all vulnerable people in Ontario. This is about ensuring a minimal standard of care across this province and learning from a hard-taught lesson of the pandemic in the shadow of a difficult summer in Ontario. This is about doing the right thing. Thank you.
Further debate, the member for Guelph.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's my pleasure to rise and speak in support of Bill 164, Protecting Vulnerable People in Supported Living Accommodations. I want to thank the member from Niagara Centre for bringing this bill forward. And I'm reminded that last week we all came together and voted in support of legislation to provide a minimum standard of care for elders being cared for in long-term care. And I think today is an opportunity for us to all come together and ensure that elders and adults with disabilities in community living congregate care settings also have a minimum standard of care, are regulated, and are inspected to ensure that the most vulnerable in our society receive the care they deserve. Speaker, I think many Ontarians would be shocked to learn that these congregate care settings are currently not regulated. And while many of these congregate care community living spaces are well cared for, there are those that are not. And those bad actors should be held accountable. We should take preventive and proactive action to ensure that proper regulations, proper minimum standards of care, and proper inspections are in place to ensure that all vulnerable people in our society have a safe place to live and a safe place to be cared for. And unfortunately, I was reminded of this very early in the pandemic, in the spring during the first wave of COVID, when I started receiving calls from people who lived in some of these community congregate care settings, saying that while the virus was spreading, they had no access to personal protective equipment. The staff coming in to provide care in these settings did not have access to personal protective equipment, and that proper public health measures were not in place. And that is something, Speaker, that we cannot allow to happen again. And I believe Bill 164 is an important step to preventing those types of conditions and that type of situation to ever happen again. And so I'm hoping that's one of the lessons that we learn from this pandemic, is that a society is measured by the way we treat the most vulnerable in our communities. A society is measured by the dignity and care and standards and regulations that we provide the most vulnerable in our communities. And so we have to decide as a society what kind of values we uphold. And for me, those values ensure that the most vulnerable in our society are cared for. So I hope we can stand together again and unite all parties in this House to establish a basic standard of care for the most vulnerable elders and adults with disabilities in congregate care settings in our community. And Speaker, I just want to conclude by once again thanking the member from Niagara Centre for bringing this bill forward, and I'm hoping all members of this House vote in favour. Thank you.
Thank you. Now return to the member for Niagara Centre for his response.
Thank you very much, Speaker, and thank you to all of my colleagues on both sides of the House for their support. Member from Whitby mentioned his municipal experience, and we have that in common. And as he will know, at the municipal level, the partisanship really melts away. And I want to assure him I'm looking forward to working in committee. There's a lot of work to do on the bill, obviously, but I think it's doable, and I hope that we kind of reward all the work that my predecessor Cindy Forrester did, and get this bill passed. Thank you to my colleague from London, Fanshawe, for relaying the story of the tragedy in London. I know the City of London and the fire services there will be very happy to see this bill moving forward. The member from Kitchener-Conestoga, thank you for mentioning the support of the Minister of Community and Social Services, and for speaking to your own constituents about the bill. The member from Nickel Bell mentioned her experience with the Community Health Centre in Sudbury, and very grateful to have her as our critic for healthcare, and thank you for her support. My friend from St. Catharines, as always, I know she'll be working with me on the issue in Niagara, where there are many supportive living homes. And the member from Guelph, thank you for reminding us that this is also a long-term care issue and connected to the issue of dignity for seniors. And so thank you to all of my colleagues for their support, and I look forward to working on this bill in committee and moving it forward. Thank you.
The time provided for private members' public business has expired. Mr. Burch has moved second reading of Bill 164, an act to establish a framework for the licensing of supportive living accommodations. Is it the pleasure of the House? My apologies, Monday morning. Is it the pleasure of the House if the motion carries? Carried. That's carried.
Second reading of the bill. Deuxième lecture du projet de loi.
Pursuant to Standing Order 101I, the bill is referred to the Committee of the Whole House. Is the majority in favor of the bill being referred to the Standing Committee on General Government? Agreed. Agreed. The bill is referred to the Standing Committee on General Government. Orders of the day. I recognize the member for Barrie-Innisfil. No further business. This House stands recessed until 10:15 this morning.